Hey, Marielle, how you doing?
Hey, Colin. I'm good. How are you feeling?
Oh, I'm great. I'm very excited to be here with you today. Do you know why?
Why?
Because it's our 1 year anniversary episode. We've been doing this together for a whole year and 16. This is our 17th episode of Bad Art. Hooray! So we were thinking that today we'd do a little retrospective on our first year of podcasting together, talk about some of what we've done, and also try to think through, of the episodes that we've done so far, what are some through lines that we can pull out? What are some of the broader themes that we're exploring, and where do we expect the podcast to go?
I think also we are looking to sort of pat ourselves on the back a little bit,
Yeah,
feeling very proud of ourselves for having made it to 1 year of the pod.
we deserve it. Hooray.
Hooray. So I
Yeah.
want to start by asking you, what were your hopes for the podcast? Because, behind the scenes for listeners, this podcast was Colin's idea. It was his brainchild, and then he asked me to sign on as co-host. So, I'm curious to know, what were your hopes for the podcast when you first streamed it up, and how do you think those hopes have played out?
Yeah, thanks. So my goals for the pod were when we started dreaming it up. I think the main goal is encapsulated by the title, bad art. I really did want to challenge the idea that art is inherently good. And I think, and a lot of people assume that art on its face is good or banal. And so we wanted to look at, what does art actually do? And a lot of those times it's bad things, right? So, we've been looking at a lot in this pod how the Trump administration uses art to advance its agenda, but also, democratic administration. So we've been looking at a lot of cities and how they use art within context of gentrification or anti-black politics and displacement. So to really talk about, what is art and what does it do? And to push on, I think one thing that comes up is, people will evaluate art by its image. Does that image look like something positive or negative? And I think a lot of times art that conveys a politically good message can nevertheless be a bad political force. I was thinking a lot about, as we were getting ready, about we haven't done a pod on it, but the Boyle Heights Artists Against Displacement and Art Washing, I believe they're called. A group of neighbors in Boyle Heights, Los Angeles, who smashed the windows of a gallery that was opening up in a majority Latinx neighborhood. And the gallery was really mad because we've got Mexican American artists, we've got queer artists, we're doing the representation thing, and the people in the neighborhood were like, well, yeah, but you're gonna be the reason we can't afford to rent, And so I think we wanna trouble this idea about what art is. That's probably the primary thing.
I I absolutely agree. I think my goals were really in line with the Boyle Heights example that you were just discussing. There's this tendency for art to be imagined as a domain of elite tastemakers, as we all know, right? And one of the, I don't know if the right word is dangers. That's the word that came to mind. So I'll just go with that. One of the dangers of the current moment in the arts is that many of these elite tastemakers have adopted the language of social justice. And not just, I think for many of them, this is not a question of cynically co opting this language. I think that a lot of artists genuinely believe in social justice causes and genuinely understand their artistic practice as advancing those causes, right? I think, yeah, I don't think that's a controversial thing to say. If you know artists, you know that many of them are, they're good people fighting for good causes. But that doesn't automatically erase this division between the elite and the masses that current artistic worlds seem to reproduce at every turn. And a lot of that has to do with the crazy profits available to be made in art. And so, yeah, I like your Boyle Heights example because it lays bare exactly that dynamic, right? And that it's not just about identity. It's not just about the identity of the artists. Those same artists probably had works that were themselves anti-gentrification, right? That doesn't take away from the gentrifying effects of the art gallery. And so I think for me, one of the goals that I was most concerned with in creating this podcast was returning art to the sphere of like material life, right? So not just what does it look like, who makes it, what's the message, but how is it embedded in everyday conflicts, in the distribution of power, questions like that. I think we've tried to spotlight those kinds of questions.
Yeah, that's so important, and highlighting the amount of money in the arts. Like there's just so much money in the arts, and we should ask why it's there. Why do people want to spend money on this? What are they trying to achieve? And often that's at odds with the stated goals that art presents. Before we move on, I was reminded of there was a recent you know that I have particular beef with Shepard Fairey among a few other artists. And we've never really gotten into it on the pod, but Democracy Now! Had, like, an interview with Shepard Fairey about, like, the art he's making now, which is, anti-Trump in some way or another. He's got, a very trite canvas of, Statue of Liberty in handcuffs or something.
Mm.
Uh But it's wild that he can get away with painting images and having a show that brands itself as social justice, and he painted a mural in Philadelphia, which is on the side of a Hilton hotel, advertising the Hilton, which he calls social justice, which has no connection to justice at all. But he's made his career as a gentrifier, like, since being a graffiti artist. He was hired by Detroit to, contribute to the gentrification of Detroit's downtown. He was hired by a real estate developer in Miami to drive the gentrification of the Wynwood district. And there's a documentary about the gentrification of the Wynwood district where they interview him, and he says, "I don't care if I cause gentrification. I just want to make art." And you can say that shit, and then you can say, "Hey, I'm a social justice artist." Like, it's a real contradiction in terms, and most people aren't so blunt about it, but it's still, we have to get to the root of who's paying for this and why. And, again, what does it actually do?
And I think also that that gets to the question of what are the publics or audiences for art, right? So Shepard Fairey is welcome to say whatever the fuck he wants, right? Like, he can cynically use his art to make a lot of money and say he doesn't care about gentrification and, out the other side of his mouth, self-identify as a social justice artist. Like, I can think of dozens of artists who made those kinds of wildly contradictory claims at some point in their careers. And the reality is that artists have very little control over how their art is received, right? It is the audiences for art. And you can think of that as spectator publics. You can think of that as buyers. You can think of that as curators. You can think of that as grant funders, right? Academics can be an audience for art too. Critics. These are all kind of distinct but overlapping audiences for art. Those audiences are who gets to decide how to evaluate Shepard Fairey's claims about what he's doing. And so one of my hopes for this podcast is to intervene in that audience side conversation, right? That we can evaluate these statements by artists critically. We can put what they're doing in conversation with what they claim to be doing and reach our own conclusions about it. And one of my hopes is that in this first year of the podcast, we've maybe surfaced some tools for having those conversations as an audience. We're also like we're in this moment where critical audiences for the arts are becoming harder and harder to come by. And so I think, maybe that's where I see our contribution going in the future is to build up kind of this art of critique within the public sphere of our audiences.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate that. I think that's well said. Speaking of critique, I think one thing I want to highlight, and I'm not 100% sure that you and I are on the same page here, so it'll be interesting to see.
Mhm.
But one of the things I wanted to do, at least when starting the pod, is really be careful about as we said, doing like a material critique more than a aesthetic critique, more than a reading. And we have done some readings on the pod, and I think that's, fine. And sometimes we find really interesting things by like looking at what art says and how it works aesthetically. But I do want to make a focus on art as a material fact that exists in the world and needs to be considered in that way.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm curious to know when you think about that as a focus for the podcast. I don't disagree with you. I think that's important to consider, but maybe some of my resistance to that as a primary mode of working comes down to how interesting of a story can we make that for the podcast? As in, is it not just the same story over and over again? Would we not just end up with a bunch of episodes that are like, look at the material conditions of this art? It's bad.
Interesting. Well, the material conditions of the art are bad. But, I think there are some different episodes in our stable at this point. We have a couple episodes on cities and the way art has in one way or another been used as a tool of gentrification. We have several episodes on Trump and how he's used art to advance a very cynical white supremacist reactionary politics. We have a couple episodes on solidarity or international warfare and the position of art in there. So I do think that there is a spread of things that we've identified that the podcast is moving into where I think we can continue to build those productively without losing our thread.
I think part of what I'm hearing in what you said is that, in fact, to talk about the material conditions for art is to talk about a lot of different things, right? Not just any one thing. So, the material conditions of art does not just mean the way that art functions as a speculative object for investors.
Right.
It doesn't just mean the effects that museums and galleries have on gentrification in urban areas. It also entails things like the materiality of war, right?
Right.
Which is, I'm really proud of that episode because I think that that pushed us to think about materiality in a different way from some of our other conversations about the material conditions under which art is made and experienced.
I did have like a second piece. Like so we've been talking about the negative, but I think it came out in our interview with Nick Sturm. We both like art.
Truth comes out.
We posture as hostile, but as consumers, as spectators, as participants, we enjoy and appreciate art, believe that it has value of some kind.
Yeah, we're not dictators, right? Like, we would not spend all of this time being haters if we weren't actually quite invested in some other way that art could be.
I mean, I do enjoy a good hate session on, on some bad art, but we do have a question of like, what is good art also, which is here, which is, where do you locate art that actually does make a social or political difference for the better?
Mhm.
It's a difficult question, but I think we've pointed at times to various activist groups that have exist in a very different context, I think, than the mainstream art world. And so, our second episode was an interview with Lisa Kelly and Amira McClendon from Memorialize the Movement, a group which is preserving art from the George Floyd uprising, which was made spontaneously, much of it not by professional artists, much of it not funded, but was part of a broader social mobilization and was important in that context. Episode that just came out is an interview with Jennifer Lynn Kelly about her book Invited to Witness about solidarity tourism in Israel and Palestine or in Palestine. And, the Gaza chapter of that book, there's a lot of speculative art made by Gazans to imagine what liberation looks like, to imagine a future where tourism to Gaza is possible, and to construct that, right? So there are cases where we can identify art doing something positive, even in quite negative situations. And I think as the pod goes forward, maybe something that's interesting is to explore the intersection between, what we're speculatively identifying as good art and the context in which art, which maybe aspires to be good, is still bad.
Yeah, because I think that that is a risk for any practitioner of activist art, right?
Yeah.
You know, I think about the most recent episode, and then I think about our earlier episode on Banksy and Palestine, and we can see just how fine a line that is to walk, right? Where, I think we agreed like Banksy has really good intentions in making art in Palestine, and yet, in that episode, of course, we looked at some of the ways in which those good intentions crumble just in the face of what it is to make art in Palestine. And I think, like, I too am absolutely invested in versions of art that can advance a better politics, a more hopeful future, and I believe that those absolutely exist out there. But I think it's so much easier to make a podcast as a hater
Yeah.
and, advocating for something. And I think that this is also something that you and I have both navigated in our research work, where we both have done research in contexts where, in your case, artists, in my case, architects, are working in this more activist and speculative mode. And not to say that it's always perfect, right? But I think both of us have had these research experiences where we've met people who are doing really good work that is changing things for the better. And we're trying to write about that, both to communicate these lessons to people in other parts of the world who may not be aware that this is going on, right? But also to theorize it, right? And to figure out how is it that these kinds of artistic or design interventions can be effective at making the world a better place. And it's, not to complain because it's so much fun to be an anthropologist, but writing anthropology in an optimistic mode is sometimes a tough project to take on. There is a lot of pressure to be a hater, to be cynical, to poke holes in what are often like very good things that artists, architects are doing. And so I think like it's interesting to me how often we've been haters so far on the podcast, given that I think neither of us works primarily as a hater in our research facing work. So you could ask, well, is that the nature of podcasts to really like foster that kind of more critical discourse, or is this kind of a growth area for us?
I think it's multiple things, but where I would push back is I would say it's easier to be a hater, but I think it's also necessary in this case. We're talking about one of the goals is to convince people that art can be bad. I think there is an initial resistance to that. Like beyond so I mean there's a play on words in our title, right? And everyone has seen, thrift store art or, something that fails aesthetically. But obviously that's not what we're talking about. We really don't care, that that art may may or may not be good in technical terms. But convincing people that art is bad intrinsically, politically, requires like a greater effort. So I think, one of the reasons we focused on that so far in the pod is just to like really push against, I think, people's intrinsic defenses, intrinsic love of art and say, like, let's think about what this is doing. That said, I do think it's a growth area for the pod. I hope that as we go forward, we do engage some more positive visions and start to talk about what they might look like. But I think those have to come out of like a critical framework of saying, what's the problem space that we're operating in? It's one where the things that art does are quite detrimental to society, and most people don't know that.
Right.
Well, you brought up my transition because we did want to talk about our research backgrounds a little bit and how that informs what we're doing. I think I should say, Marielle, you and I, we met in graduate school. We were both students in the Department of Anthropology at UC Irvine. You were 1 year ahead of me. And I think we were friends for a while. But one of the things that happened is we started applying separately to conferences, and people would put us on the same panel and say, like, you two are thinking about the same things. And they were right. Like, we had real questions, in my case artists, your case architects, but how they were trying to put together a better world in very complex political situations. Do you want to talk about a little bit about your research background first, and I'll say a little bit about where I'm coming from?
Sure. Yeah. So, yeah, I'll first say that yeah, there was this moment of time. There was, I think, like one spring in particular where it was like every conference that I went to, I was on a panel with you. And, you know, I remember, like, it's not like I was perplexed, right? Like, I knew that there was overlap in our research, but at the time, I thought that the overlap mainly had to do with how we were connecting urban anthropology to these questions about art and aesthetics, because we're both also urban anthropologists. So at the time, I was like, oh, like, this is where the confluence at panels is coming from, is that that link between aesthetics and urban anthropology. But yeah, I think now I see it a little bit differently. I don't think it's just about the fact that we both work on aesthetics and also urban stuff. I think the kind of like the deeper conversation that we're both engaged with in our work has to do with the really granular work that artists do. And so I think we're both really attentive to questions of technique in art and in urban planning and architectural design. And these are like really granular decisions that individual artists or small groups of architects are making, but that have these ripple effects on whole cities. And so I think that's kind of a lot of the shared interest in our work is tracing those ripples, how they start with individual practitioners or individual studios or galleries and end up really changing the face of life in a city for millions of people. So my work is based in Barcelona, where I am interested in what you could call grassroots architecture and what you could call participatory planning. So, participatory planning, anyone who has lived in a city, you've seen some version of this, in the United States too. This can look like a community meeting that is called to get input on a bike path. This can look like I read a really lovely photo essay in the New York Times of all places about public playgrounds that have been planned with the input of the school children who go to the school where the playground is located. So, for instance, like a school playground where a lot of the kids were braiding each other's hair at recess, and so they built, like, these special, like, hair braiding seating into the playground with, like, multi-level seating so that you can have, kind of like a ladder of people braiding each other's hair simultaneously, which I thought was so cute.
I'm interjecting to say that I love that. Sorry.
It's a great idea, right? And it's like, you know, I don't think that if you look in a playground supply catalog, you're going to find that as a ready-made option to buy for a playground, but it's so cool, right? And it's really responding to the needs of those kids and what they were already doing at recess. So these would be examples of participatory planning. What is, I think, less familiar to Americans is what I refer to as grassroots architecture. So these are cases where regular people without training, oftentimes without permission to do so, are physically building their own surroundings. So, probably the most common version that you would see in the United States is a community garden, right? So, neighbors taking over some sort of vacant or abandoned space in their neighborhood to plant things, right? But imagine if that weren't just about planting things, and instead those neighbors might be building a playground, let's say, in that space, or creating a theater in that space, right? These are the kinds of things that I studied in Barcelona. And what I'm most interested in is the ways in which these kinds of really hands-on projects, whether you're talking about, hands-on in a grassroots sense or hands-on in the sense of neighborhood residents participating directly in governmental decision making about what their surroundings should look like and how that's going to happen. I'm really interested in these hands-on practices of making the city as democratic practices, because so often we think about democratic politics as being about like these really abstract questions or about participating in political institutions that are quite distant from us. Or even when we're thinking like in kind of a more bowling alone sort of way about democratic communities, we think of them as primarily communities that are organized around talk and ideas and some version of conviviality. But there's actually this deeply material component to democracy too. And so that's what I try to get at through my work on grassroots architecture and participatory planning.
You're reminding me of a conversation which we had, I think, in preparation for our Weird Little Architects episode about the architects who work for Trump or who advance his agenda. So it didn't make it into the episode, but we had talked about how for those architects, the thing that makes democracy is the facade, right? They want everything in Washington, D.C. to be neoclassical, and they say neoclassical architecture is what makes democracy. And it was a real interesting thing to juxtapose against your research, right? Because for you in Spain, what makes democracy is creating spaces where people can come together and make the world themselves. If correct me if I'm like a little bit
No,
misphrasing that.
that's great.
I think you had some really interesting insights into that. And then the thing about that that's especially interesting to me is that while you were doing your research, right, you had all of these participatory planning things going on, the grassroots architecture going on, and at the same time, both Spain and Barcelona were going through some kind of democratic transition, moving into a more left-wing democratic politics. And the stuff that you were studying had an influence on how that worked in practice. Would you share a little bit about that?
Yeah. So it's interesting to try to characterize like what is that form of influence, right?
Yeah.
So so I had conducted preliminary research in Barcelona in 2013 and in 2014 and started my long-term field work in September 2015. A couple of months before I started that work in 2015, so during my preliminary field work, the mayor of Barcelona was like a kind of a center right mayor. And shortly before I went back in 2015, so I think the municipal elections were like in April or May, and then I went back in early September. Ada Colau, who was the leader of a brand new political party in Barcelona, and had been previously known for her work with the PAH, which is in English, you would call it like the platform for people affected by mortgages. So this was a group that grew out of the 2008 financial crisis, where in Spain, as in America, actually, one of the main effects of the 2008 financial crisis was that people were in these over-leveraged mortgages, right? And so this was a group that was fighting for people to stay in their homes, fighting for basically for a sweeping policy change regarding how mortgages would be treated in Spain. In contrast to in the United States, mortgages were a relatively new financial instrument in Spain at the time of the crisis. And so there were a lot of questions about like, should the government like allow for this to happen, right? For people to take on these mortgages, become completely immiserated, completely vulnerable to market forces. There's like a wave of suicides in Spain because of what was going on with mortgages. So this was a group that was fighting for changes to how mortgages were handled and fighting against evictions that banks were carrying out to people holding on to underwater mortgages. So she was one of the spokespeople for this group. That was how people in Barcelona came to know her. They came to know her through, for instance, like protests at IKEA in Barcelona. And then they voted her in as mayor.
Why IKEA?
To answer that, I would have to give you this like really clever like marketing booklet that her party produced that was like an IKEA catalog. So there was a protest at IKEA, but then there was like this whole wave of discourse about IKEA and kind of reinterpreting it through the lens of like housing politics.
I think there are grounds for a future episode about IKEA in general. Like honestly, like
Uh,
we have a lot to say about IKEA, and
Ew.
have some friends who work specifically on IKEA directly, so we could pull something interesting.
And there's maybe room to think about like how have different political formations engaged IKEA as
Mhm.
as an interlocutor for like their aspirations about housing and democracy, right? Which actually like this is something that I have been thinking about in terms of growth areas for the podcast is to think about the democratic valences of art through this lens of like a global democratic culture, right?
Yeah.
And the way in which like IKEA is actually a great example, right? We both worked with Keith Murphy at UC Irvine. He traces the ways in which IKEA sort of crystallized this democratic discourse and democratic aspirations in Sweden. But what we can see is that as IKEA has become like a global brand, those democratic discourses travel and change as they travel, right? And so, I don't think it's a coincidence that the PAH was staging protests at IKEA. I don't think it's a coincidence that Barcelona en Comú, which is Ada Colau's political party, one of their early kind of marketing gimmicks after they were elected was this IKEA catalog of their policy platform. They're picking up on something, right?
Yeah.
But also intervening in what that something is, right?
Well, it's really funny because, when I was doing my research in Amman, Jordan, the first IKEA in Amman had just opened like a year or two before.
Oh.
Yeah, and it was similarly like from a certain set, right? But from a certain set, it was taken as a symbol that Amman was arriving as like a part of the world that it had not been a part of before, and had like kind of access to Western consumer culture and cosmopolitan identities. I mean, IKEA's different register in Amman than here. Like affording it is a bigger challenge, I think, for the majority of families. Whereas I think here IKEA is your cheap furniture, but it did have that. Part of the transformations going on in Amman when I was there was like setting up an IKEA, changing the tax law so that IKEA could function, and
Mhm.
there were international grocery stores as well. So Carrefour opened a couple of shops on that scale. Like there were a few of these like super international grocery stores and other things that were changing the ways that Amman wealthier Amman residents lived and shopped. Which is maybe a good transition for me to talk a little bit about my research. So,
Yeah.
so I went to Amman shortly after the regional upheaval in the Middle East known as the Arab Spring, which had big democratic aspirations, rarely fully realized, and which had, toppled dictators in Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, eventually Syria, and promoted a bunch of or led to a bunch of protests elsewhere. In Amman, those were very small. There was not significant uprising in Amman, partly because the city already has a lot of its own strife. And so it's hard to get people to work together in Amman because they're divided along lines of class There's a lot of hostility between Jordanians and the various immigrant groups that live in Amman, including, a large number of Palestinians, Iraqis, now Syrians. Like this, the social division in the city was an obstacle to mass politics. But the one place where things did take place was in this art gallery where I started doing my research. This place called Makan Art Space was hosting, for various reasons, a upstart news blog, which just before the incidents that inspired the Arab Spring took place, had been hosting little debates in the art space. And because everyone was excited about what was going on regionally, the art space became a gathering place for people from around the city to come and talk about, what is democracy? Why do we have a monarchy? What are the secret police doing? How can we spread messages over social media? Like this democratic imagination was able to take shape in the art space. And to the extent that protests took place, some of them were organized in the art gallery and moved out to the protest site. And the monarchy, very worried about what was happening regionally, came to the art gallery, like a member of the royal family came and said, "Here are some reforms we will make. Please don't overthrow us." Um,
Promising reforms to the art gallery?
like to the people gathered in the art gallery, yeah.
Incredible.
So there was like a real democratic moment happening in and extending out of this art gallery, and I was really curious, like, why did the gallery make space for this to happen? And so one of the things I started studying is like what happens in the actual places where artists gather. Why are these spaces different from the rest of the city? And in Amman, particularly, artists had worked on these sites to be places of democratic imaginings, queer and feminist community, pro-Palestinian activism, anti-imperial activism to a degree, although they were largely funded by Europe, which has its own negative valences. So there were lots of problems about where does the money come from. So one thing happening was the activism moving through the art world. Another thing was after the Arab Spring, they were like, well, this didn't work because the city's so divided. So artists started doing residencies in parts of the city where artists didn't normally go. So the poorer parts of the city, basically, most of the artists were pretty rich, and they would, go hang out in poorer neighborhoods and do participatory art, to try to get people to meet with them and build political community. I am skeptical about how well that worked, but the imagining that art could be a something for building a political community in Amman was a really powerful idea at the time I was there. And then at the same time, the arts were a center of gentrification, and they were a center of diplomatic funding coming from the US, which was really embarrassed by the war on terror and was trying to make Arab people its friends again. So there was all this political motion through the arts, and I really wanted to find out how it worked. And I do think in that case, that's it was structural, right? It's who's funding the arts, where are they doing it, who's coming together, and what sorts of communities does that engender became the focus of my research there. And then I should say, subsequently, I did do research in Minneapolis. That's where I met Lisa Kelly and Amira McClendon. And now I live in Philadelphia, which claims to be the mural capital of the world and has a really weird politics wrapped up in its funding of the arts, which I think we've talked on the pod about before, but is worth noting that urban development in Philadelphia moves through the arts and a lot of other things too.
I think it's really interesting in the story that you just told us about the evolution of this art space in Amman. What's really striking is kind of the shrinking of ambition over time, right? That they began with kind of staging a miniature Arab Spring within the art world that got the monarchy to pay attention to them and offer reforms. And where they ended was doing participatory art projects in low income neighborhoods with, you're saying, not much efficacy, right? I can understand the underlying logic, right? Like what you explained about how the divisions within Iman made real change impossible. Like, of course, then that means that you need activists who are willing to address those divisions at their source. So I can totally see how the artists arrived at that at that artistic practice. But at the same time, like, it's kind of depressing, right? To think about where they started and where they ended up. So I'm wondering what you make of that as someone who is, as we talked about earlier, you are invested in good art that has good politics. So what do you make of this evolution of these Jordanian artists' artistic practices?
That's a really tough question. I want to say something like, yeah, I want to say something about a specific art project. So, an art project that is controversial in Amman, but which I admire greatly, but which I see lots of problems with, is called an urban reflection. It's a residency project which was organized by someone named Nafal El Taba, who did it as the completion of her MFA, and it was took 7 artists, mostly wealthy artists, to a working class neighborhood called Jabal Al Kala, where they did participatory art. And really, like, in 2012, so right in the heat of the Arab Spring moment, like, let's go build some community, find out how we can connect across these barriers. And to say it did nothing is unfair. Like, I've heard people say, well, they were just tourists, or, other like, people didn't care that they were there, but they had to negotiate with the people who lived there to be able to do the project in the first place. They had to recruit them. They had to, yeah, negotiate for access. And one of the things that happened is the city at that time was like, let's build a tourist trail right through this neighborhood. Because at the top of the neighborhood, there's a spectacular citadel, which includes Byzantine, Roman, and Umayyad ruins. At the bottom of the hill, like Jabal Kala is on a hill, at the bottom of the hill, there's a Roman theater. So the government was like, what if we just build a monorail, like a ski lift, a funicular through the neighborhood, so that tourists don't have to walk up this hill, which they're not going to walk up because it's very tall. And, like, great for the city, horrible for everyone who lives in this neighborhood. But because the artists were there, they were able to help draw attention to the neighborhood and stop the funicular from being built. It never got built. Some other things did happen, like they did fence in the Citadel, which had been a place where neighborhood kids went to play. Like, there are other things that took place that were not so good, but, like, the big destructive project was stopped by virtue of the artists being there. I mean, on the other hand, you know, since then, there have been at least a half dozen other art projects which have taken place in that neighborhood. Many of them even less attentive to their social responsibility. Like, it's like, let's go paint in this neighborhood as a way of, like, just being able to paint, like, very Shepard Fairey-esque, like, someone's giving me money to paint a mural, I'm gonna go paint a mural. And so in some ways, like, that neighborhood hasn't gentrified, but it is like an edge of this encroaching gentrification in Amman's urban core, right? So, like, on the one hand, the artists are able to advocate. On the other hand, they're connected to, like, the urban renewal project, which is happening in Amman right now, which is very disruptive. And it's hard to disassociate those 2 things. I think the other thing that happened is the Arab Spring was defeated, right? Like, in Syria, it turned into a 10-year-long civil war, and in Egypt, a dictatorship reasserted itself and sort of defeated all of the hopes that people had for something positive to happen, you know? And so in 2014, 2015, people were, like, pretty excited, like, social change is coming, like, there's a democratic horizon, or the future looks bright. By 2016, people were telling me how depressed they were, like, all the time.
Mhm.
And it was because, like, the aspiration of hope was defeated. And you can see similar things here, right? Like I said, I also did work in Minneapolis. There was a moment where it was possible to believe that the system of white supremacy enforced by the police was going to be radically transformed, if not destroyed, right? Like, that there was, like, a moment where change was really possible, and that got stopped, you know? And once it got stopped, it was done. It's backtracked, it's fallen off, and very few people can recall that moment of hope even anymore.
Mhm.
So, I mean, I think these moments of possibility are very small. There are ways that artists can help capture them. And also in Minneapolis, like the arts were a huge thing, and George Floyd Square was secured in part through the efforts of artists who were already based in the neighborhood because the city put them there to help gentrify that neighborhood, which is very Black and indigenous. So like there's a push and pull, and it's really interesting to me. Probably require much more to really get into that in depth, but I do think like that tension is there, and it's something that in my work I'm trying to be attentive to. Like, both people are using the arts together. Both sides are using the arts together, and who has control at any given moment is not stable. So the fact that arts are needed for urban development, on the one hand, is very bad. On the other hand, creates possibilities for artists and cultural producers to do other things. There's not a possibility to collapse it on them really, because the arts are so important to how cities and national governments work these days.
Right. It creates points of leverage.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was a great answer.
Thanks. So we wanted to reflect back on some of the episodes that we've made, some of our experience making the pod so far. So, Marielle, what have your favorite episodes been thus far?
That's such a good question. I mean, I think Weird Little Architects is definitely up
Mm.
there for me, and I think for a lot of our listeners too. I think that d correct me if I'm wrong, when you and I started working on this podcast a year ago,
Mhm.
was it not the case that Weird Little Architects and Very Fine Statues were kind of one mega episode that we tried to record all at once?
Yeah, we were thinking like, what is Trump's art policy? And we were going to do that as one episode. And we kept failing, actually. We recorded it like 4 or 5 times, and
Yeah.
it couldn't hold together because there was so much there. And I think now it's actually 3 episodes. So Very Fine Statues on both sides, Weird Little Architects, and It's Brutal are all pieces of what we had imagined as being one episode when we started.
One mega episode,
Yeah.
but I remember the first recording session for that was, like, 2 hours long.
We never got to like what we were talking about.
Oh, exactly, because there's so much there, and so I think one of the reasons that Weird Little Architects is one of my favorites is because it marked this learning moment for us, right? About kind of sort of the architecture of a podcast episode, right? Like how it has to be structured in order to work. And once we figured out those kind of craft points about
Mm.
making the pod, it helped us really find our voice. Like I think this is an early-ish episode where we started to really hit our stride in terms of how we approach these questions as a podcast and what kinds of interlocutors we're taking on. And so, yeah, I think it's one of my favorites for those reasons.
Yeah, I thought that was a really fun one too, and part of why it was fun was because we had to learn a lot to be able to do it. Like, it was outside of both of our central bodies of knowledge. Like, who are these people and why are they so weird? And the more we learned, the stranger it got. Like, I kept sending you little texts like, "Look at what these weird guys are doing."
It was also like once we started looking for these guys, they were everywhere.
Yeah.
They continue to be everywhere, right? Like there's this omnipresence of like art and architecture policy and planning policy in the Trump administration, right? So if you think about the Triumphal Arch, if you think about the White House ballroom, if you think about the reflecting pool, the helipad, right? Like
Mm.
partly these things are happening because Trump is a real estate developer and he, approaches everything as a real estate project. But it's also partly happening because of the rich symbolic valence that Washington, D.C. had long before Trump, right? That's what makes it, this like, what's the number of alarms that makes for a really big fire?
5.
5, that's what I thought. Okay, that's what makes it a five-alarm fire every time that he intervenes in one of these, iconic sites in Washington, DC, is this heavy symbolism, uh, that was already there.
And we should also add, like, his takeover of the Kennedy Center, his statues project, which we talked about in our first episode. You're reminding me, like, a thing that I did wanna think about So there's a podcast that you and I think, both like, called In Bed with the Right. It's a great podcast about the right's gender politics, but they did a series last year called Project 1933, where they looked at the first years of Hitler's rise to power and contrasted it with Trump's rise to power. And some things are similar, some things are different. But one of the things that was interesting to me is the host did talk for a significant amount of time on one episode about how much the Nazis loved art, right? And like how they wanted to be the inheritors of Beethoven and great authors and artists. They were the inheritors of German civilization through the arts. And the host then said, I don't think that the MAGA guys see themselves that way. And I was like, well, I disagree. And I might not have disagreed if I hadn't been doing the pod, but they really are trying to claim the mantle of artistic history in the US for themselves, and they are very angry that they don't get taken seriously as artists when they feel they know what beauty is and we don't. You know what I mean? Like, they have, like, a real serious commitment to the arts, even if it's a frustrated one, and, as part of how they think about what the United States is.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I am tempted to reply that you are right and they are right. I think that it reveals kind of the factional nature of the current MAGA movement. So I think you have parts that, as you're describing, are absolutely invested in that kind of Western art history kind of perspective on what it means to wield power in the United States. And then you have other factions of the movement that could not care less, right? That are like, Kid Rock is the main avatar of all of it. And then you have like the classical statues avatar people on Twitter, right? These are like different factions within the movement. But like I wonder how they feel about each other. Someone should ask them that.
That's worth inquiry.
But I think that that gets to sort of an unexpected dynamic to this podcast as well, which is how much we have felt pushed to address developments in the Trump administration on the podcast.
Yeah, and I mean, there are several things we haven't covered,
Yeah.
but it was also, we would be recording the Confederate statues episode, and they would announce that they were reinstalling the Confederate statue at Arlington. Or we have like alarms in our It's Brutal episode because we had to re-record it so many times because Stephen Miller was coming on Fox News and making speeches about how Democrats like brutalist architecture and how, that's a sign of their moral depravity. And we'd be like, well, we got to re-record this now. We thought it was like pretty cut and dry. Or even, I was noting when we did our War on Terror episode, not that the War on Terror was refought, but that for the spectacle, for the aesthetic, Trump invaded Venezuela and like, like used the art of it to be like a backdrop for the fascism that he is after.
Right. I feel like we've had several different episodes where we like to sort of go behind the scenes of how this podcast is made. We have a topic list of possible episodes that we're constantly adding to. And, when we first think through a topic, we flesh out at least a little bit like what kind of approach we're going to take to that topic. And so we had several episodes where we were thinking of them as primarily historical episodes, right? Revisiting a moment in time, figuring like unpacking kind of what was going on then, that then became super contemporary through the actions of the Trump administration. And I think that that was sometimes tough for us to adapt to, mainly just on the, from the perspective of we had to do a lot of extra work and recording because things were changing in a way that we didn't anticipate. But I think it also speaks to precisely the kinds of interests that we have in art, right?
Right.
That these were never just questions of aesthetics, that they are a material part of our politics to this day.
Yeah. Well, I'll put out there, like, in terms of like what we weren't expecting, you know, one of the things on our very first episode list was to do an episode on the semi-quincentennial celebration. This is before like Trump took it over. We were like, oh, they're spending a lot of money on this in order to develop Philadelphia and other cities. Like, what's the money going to? Who's doing it? This would be an interesting episode to do. And then it became all about Trump. And that, wasn't something we expected when we
Oh,
planned it. I
that's
think
great.
we also had the Super Bowl on there, like, and we didn't think, the Charlie Kirk sideshow was gonna happen. We were just like, "Oh, the Super Bowl is an interesting thing in and of itself." And then they've got, like, Kid Rock doing whatever weird thing he did on a separate channel. All of pop culture is like a target for them, and it makes it a weird thing for us when we're thinking it's somehow outside. Outside's the wrong word, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, or that pop culture is somehow independent of
Yeah.
political projects, yeah.
I wanted to highlight one other episode that we did. So your favorite was Weird Little Architects, which I really enjoyed too. I wanted to highlight the one we did right after that, our interview with Nick Sturm. I think that was super interesting, partly because he was so outside our wheelhouse. His knowledge of poetry publishing was fascinating to me, and we got to learn about it.
So much fun to learn from Nick, a lovely podcast guest, he is a great teacher.
So that was just really exciting because it was by and large, entirely new information, but really exciting and fit within the pod and broadened our scope to like, yeah, we can talk about poetry too. So we did want to quickly each take a couple thoughts about where the podcast might go in the future. Would you like to start us off?
Sure. So, one thing that I've been thinking about is what are some ways to bring a more international and transnational perspective to the podcast? Because in this first season, we have really we've had a maybe larger than expected number of episodes that are based in the United States, partly as we were saying earlier, because an episode that we thought would be one episode about Trump administration arts policies ballooned into three. But, in addition to our episodes that are based in the United States, many of the other episodes have focused on specific other, like individual other countries or cities where there's some artistic thing happening that we've been interested in. And one direction in which I hope we're able to grow in the next season of the podcast is to think more about the linkages between different national contexts when it comes to art. So, we know that the whole artistic scene is very transnational. We know that many artists are highly mobile, cosmopolitan people. And, I think there's a lot of room there to think more expansively about what that means and how it affects the goodness or badness of art.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I mean, we could easily do an episode on international travel of artists. We could
Mhm.
do an episode on artistic diplomacy. Places where the artistic travel does not go could be interesting as well, or alternate circuits.
Yes.
So I think there is some fun stuff to dig into there.
What about you? What are some directions that you want to take the podcast in going forward?
So I mean, I've been thinking about what is our mandate. We've definitely had like one or two episodes where our interpretation of art was loose, which I think is fine. It is an art and politics podcast. I don't want to talk about electoral politics too much because it's not my interest, but I think we can think broadly about what our mandate is in that way. And one thing I've been thinking about a lot lately is is how to solve the housing crisis and the rent crisis, which I think is in some ways connected to art because art and the growth machine are connected. But I think there are ways that like connects with our mandate, and I want to think about like how to think about real political problems and their solutions through the framework of the podcast. I think would be something I'd be excited to dig into as we go.
Yeah, I really like that idea.
Thanks. All right. Well, one other thing we have to say, I don't know if you want to say it or I want to say it, but we will miss you for several months.
Yeah. So in addition to upcoming plans for the podcast, I have a rapidly upcoming plan in my personal life, which is that I will be going on parental leave sometime in early August. I'm expecting a baby, and so I will be off the podcast until next year while I'm on parental leave.
And yeah, so on behalf of however small or big our pod audience is, congratulations to you and John. And I hope that it's a great experience for you both.
Thank you.
Yeah. And we will be so excited to have you back when you're ready to come
Oh,
back.
me too. Yeah, I will miss doing the pod with you, but I'm also very much looking forward to the content that you will produce while I'm on leave that I'll be able to listen to just as a regular podcast listener.
Yeah. And on that note, not entirely clear what that's going to look like yet for listeners, but I am hoping to do some interviews. Maybe if I can get a guest co-host to do an episode on an area of their interest, we'll do that as well. And there will be episodes coming out over the next few months. They'll just have like a experimental feel probably for as we go forward. But that's where we're at. So, Marielle, congratulations. We've been doing this for a whole year.
Yeah.
Hooray, hooray. What an accomplishment.
What an accomplishment. We do have to thank a few of the people
Oh,
who helped us along the way.
yes. Yes, we do. So Simone Popperell, what an incredible help you were in getting us started and helping us understand how to like make an episode work. Your advice was invaluable.
Truly, truly, like, yeah, I mean, just such stellar advice. Simone is such an incisive listener. She has a beautiful ear for podcast content. Yeah.
And if you'd like to hear Simone herself, she gave us a couple minutes of audio in the It's Brutal episode talking about her experience of brutalism in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much, Simone. We'd like to thank Claire Panetta. You're in an episode that has not aired yet, despite it being recorded 7 or 8 months ago. It is going to come out. But Claire helped us plan and put together a episode about the memorialization of 9/11, something she's an expert in. And also in the episode when it was recorded, I had not been to the 9/11 Memorial Museum. Claire later took me personally on a tour, which was fantastic and very weird. So that's not included in the episode, but we will be releasing the episode, we think, as it gets closer to the memorial of 9/11 this year, because it seems like we waited long enough that it's probably worth putting it at a temporarily appropriate date. But thank you, Claire. You're amazing. People should check out Claire's work. She's an excellent scholar. And the last person we need to thank is Lily Marty, our production assistant for the summer, who's been helping us with editing and also doing some online promotion of the pod, which we really appreciate. So, Lily, thank you so much.
Thank you, Lily. All right. So how do you want to wrap up?
Well, you've been listening to Bad Art for a year now. Uh, if you haven't listened to the past episodes, go back and give them a listen. I think some of them are pretty good. And we're excited to continue making the pod going forward.
Thanks for hanging with us for the past year, for sticking around as we figured out how to, do this whole podcast thing. And thank you for your support for the podcast.
Yeah. And if you haven't done it, please give us some ratings on your podcast listening apps. Please review us. Please tell your friends about the pod and help us grow. We're excited to continue developing the pod over next year and excited for Marielle. So thanks everyone for listening. We'll talk to you next time. Bye.
Bye.
Hooray.
Yay.